Okay, so today we're going for something a little bit different. Basically what we're going to be trying to do here is we're going to be trying to correlate what we can see from the video replay and what we can see from MoTeC. And also what I'm going to be doing for this is I will be providing this MoTeC workbook. What I'm going to try and do is I'll try and put an iRacing thread up. Probably it'll be in the off-topic discussion. I would put it in the telemetry one, but no one reads it, so it'll probably go in the off-topic discussion just so that more people really see it. Really, what the idea behind this is using the video replay, a pretty simplified MoTeC workbook, and just really figuring out, one, improving how you drive the car, and secondly, what you can do using the workbook to improve how the car is driving. And how you can correlate between what's going on in the video and what you're seeing, and what you can then pick up in the data. And then hopefully the idea is that once you know how what you're seeing in the actual sim correlates with what is happening in the data, you'll be able to look at just MoTeC and figure it out from that without really having to look at the video. But we're not really trying to say that you shouldn't look at the video, because I'm also going to show you how useful it is to be looking at the video at the same time. The car we're using is going to be a C-Spec. The reason we're using the C-Spec is because, first off, I haven't driven it in a good while, and that actually really helps for this video, because I'm not going to be terrible at driving it, but I'm not going to be great at driving it, so we're going to be able to easily see where I'm making mistakes and how I can improve, and how you can see the mistakes in the data log and so on. Secondly is because it doesn't have ABS or traction control. That's really helpful again for this video, because it means that we can show things like wheel spin and lockup much more easily. The other things are that basically the C-Spec has a range of adjustment that's pretty similar to most race cars, so this should be a kind of generalized thing that you should be able to apply to most cars. And finally, I basically need some practice in this car. I've signed up to do a series in it, and so I could do with driving it, really. So really what we're trying to cover here is basically how to use this workbook that I'll be giving to you guys, and how to use the video with it. So what we're aiming to cover is basically looking at the speed trace and how we can use that to evaluate lines. We're going to be looking at how to use variance in conjunction with the speed trace, basically so that you can pick up differences in lines, differences between drivers, and differences with regards to aero as well, including rake effects and things like that. We're also going to be looking at how you use the brakes, and how we can change the braking performance of the car by looking at the telemetry. Again, you can use this to cross-compare with other drivers, but at the same time you can also use it to tune your brake bias for your preference. We'll also be looking at rear traction problems, both under braking and acceleration. Although, as you'll see, they kind of manifest themselves pretty similar, but I'll show you that. We'll also be looking at steering inputs, its effects on lateral G, and how we can use that to look at balance of the car. We'll be looking at how to use track maps to show you things like heavy braking zones, what your gear usage is, what your high speeds are. Again, another thing you can use to look at aero. We'll also be looking at how you can look at ride heights, so that you can see how the split is working, and how you can see if the split is hitting the ground, and how you can kind of extend that to other parts of the car hitting the ground as well, or other parts of the car sort of going out of a range that you know works. Which kind of sounds a bit strange, but when we get to it, I hope you'll understand what I'm talking about. There's also a section in the workbook where you can look at the effects of camber, and how that affects how the tyres wear, the temperatures of the tyres, and also a thing which I think is quite neat is I've put in a couple of heat maps as well, so you can see what corners on the track punish the tyres the worst, and what traction zones affect the rear tyres the worst, and that kind of thing. yeah, we'll also be looking at a couple of other things as well to sort of cross-reference what we see in these heat maps, and from what we can see in the iRacing Garage screen, to sort of pick up issues with regards to how we've got camber settings and things like that. And we'll also be looking at how the replay can be used to pick up issues such as incorrect damping settings and that kind of thing. There's a little bit on looking at tire pressure, but I have looked at that in a previous video, so I won't cover that too much. But I will show you how you can use this workbook to look at tire pressures. Another thing I've also included is sort of a prototyping weather station kind of tab. It's not really that useful in terms of you're not going to be able to see anything from it, but it's just so that you've got a actual representation in MoTeC of what the weather was for that session, rather than having to go and note down exactly what it was in the iRacing session, which it can help because sometimes I forget, and I can't really if I just look in the thing and the thing in MoTeC just says, oh, the skies were 1, that's not really much use to me. So I've tried to build a little thing which tells you whether it's partly cloudy, overcast, and so on. And I'll show that at the end because it's pretty minor. But first thing we're going to do is, you can see this time I've got the video on the left here. What we're going to try and do is we're going to try and do 4 laps, and we're hopefully going to go through and we'll pick up some issues as we take the 4 laps, and from there we can then look into the telemetry and see if we can see where these issues were. So let's go for that. Alright, okay, so as you can see, we're at Road America, we're coming down into turn 1 here. If you look, you can see that the tack needle is bouncing right up above the 8 when I'm downshifting, so we can tell that the downshift technique's pretty poor, which is not entirely unexpected. Again, you can see the needles jumping around, so we've got a bit of a lock up, and again the downshifting technique's not brilliant. A little bit wide on the exit there, but not really a big problem. It's probably a good time to note that you can shift just above 8,000 in this car. Okay, as you can see, braking performance down into 3 was really poor. Probably both my downshifting technique and the bias in the car was not particularly helpful. Okay, you see how the tyre was bouncing a lot there on the left front? We'll be looking at that later on. 5 was not so bad. Again, downshifting technique is not particularly amazing through 6. Looking sort of okay through 7. Probably a bit slow there. A bit unnecessarily wide onto that curb because we didn't need to do that. See, we downshifted there and we over revved, and then immediately shifted up on exit, so we probably didn't need to put that downshift in there. Again, the RPM's jumping around a lot on the downshift, so we can see that downshifting technique needs a lot of work. That was kind of okay, but a bit wide. Probably a bit slow. Again, probably one too many downshifts there through 11. Okay, so that's the end of lap 1. But we've got 3 more laps here, so we'll just see if we improve. Not an amazing lap time there. 2:15.2, pretty slow in fact actually. Again, we see we're probably locking the rears on the downshift as the RPM trace is bouncing around. Probably one too many downshifts through there as well, actually. But what we can really see so far is that what needs the most work is the downshifting technique. But what I'll also be showing is we can see that visually quite easily. But I'll show you how you can pick that up in the MoTeC trace, so that if someone sends you a data log, you can look at it and you can see that that's where they're struggling with, and point them in that direction. Yeah, that was okay through 4, but possibly a touch slow. That's fairly decent through 5. Again, not too bad through 6, but probably a touch slow. Again, unnecessarily too wide on the exit of 7. Missed the apex by an absolute mile through 8. Probably trimmed off too much speed entering 9, because I could have used a lot more of that outside curb. Much better through 10 this time, nowhere near as wide, not suffering any of that understeer out there. Bit hesitant getting back to the throttle when I probably could have just slammed it down, but that was not bad. A couple of areas obviously around that lap which definitely could have been improved. And again, 2:14.1, which is getting a lot better. Pretty poor downshifting again into 1, so that's an area which really needs work. But I think I was actually trying to adjust the brake bias to slap. One thing I would like to ask is I'm recording a recording here, so I don't necessarily know how well this is going to show up. So if it is choppy or really poor, please let me know, and I'll have to figure a different way of doing this. I just thought it might be nice to mix in a video along with MoTeC, so that we can watch the video and have MoTeC at the same time. Yeah, this lap so far has been fairly good. The turns 1 and 2 were not amazing. What I will try and do for lap 4 is I will try and get it so that we are watching at exactly the same time, so we'll be able to see the speed trace in theory, and we'll be able to see the cursor move along as we go. Again, the downshifting technique is still pretty poor, but that's really actually helpful for the video, because I can really show you an area to improve, and how that can affect what you think is happening with the car and what is actually happening with the car. Alright, okay, so that's the end of 3, and we're coming up on a 4 here, so I'll get ready to hit the play button. Now, right, okay, so we can see the traces. Traces working okay. Hopefully I'm in the right place. Trace is possibly a fraction ahead, but you can see that we're mostly in line. See, I know I've obviously driven the lap and everything, but I can tell you that we're expecting a pretty big lockup coming into 3. Just by looking at this corrected speed trace here. And see how it drops down really aggressively and then has a lot of spikes. Yeah, there you go. But that's again why having the video is useful, because you can see how these things are appearing. Which is handy, because I find it really helps the learning curve, because I can point you out that part on the graph and go, oh okay, there's a big lock up there, but I find that a lot of the time, if anyone's like me, that won't necessarily believe them that that's actually happening until you see it. So having the visual representation alongside, I think, is a good thing. We'll just ride out the rest of this lap before we move on to actually looking at bits in detail. Again, very wide through there. As you can see, I even picked up a 1x at the top of the screen. Really, really bad on these downshifts. But I'll show you, as I've said, I'll show you how you can see that in the trace. A little bit wide through 10. Again, a little bit hesitant, but mostly good exit through 11. I think this lap was quicker. Yeah, this lap was the 13.5. Okay. Let's just pause all this. Alright, okay. So now that we've just watched the 4 laps, let's pick out some parts of each lap and see what we can really learn. As I've said numerous times, the downshifting technique was really, really bad. In the C-Spec, as the guys that know the C-Spec will know, you can basically just blip the throttle on down changes, but I found it's a pretty it's got some pretty tight tolerances on how wide the downshifting range is. So if you're even slightly wrong with your throttle blip in terms of timing or in terms of how much you've actually blipped the throttle, you'll screw up the shift, which is good for this video because you can really see them. It doesn't make me look too good, but I'm okay with that. I know I'm out of practice with this car, and that's why we picked it. As I just went through there, we could tell that one place where my downshifting technique was really bad. That was in turn 9 on lap 4. So let's make sure we're looking at that. And if we go to lap 4, and if we look at the top here, we can see our little red dot on the map. Okay, I'm going to grab this segment here. Okay, so we've grabbed that segment, and as you can see on the map, that includes coming down the straight, braking for the turn, and then re-accelerating out. Now, if we go to driving technique and we look at throttle application, you can see by looking at the throttle position at the bottom here, you can see that as I went into the turn, I shifted down. I was in 6th, I shifted down to 5th, then to 4th, then to 3rd, and then I think I shifted down to 2nd, but I'm not 100%. But either way, if we just look at these early ones, basically what we want to see for a good downshift is we want to see them equally spaced, and we want to see them of the same height, same peak height. Now, as we can see from this is really bad, because we can see that we've got this first peak, which was a 60% throttle blip, and then we have another blip which was 20%, really close in proximity to that first one. So that's a blip of a third the size and much too close to the initial down change. And then again, we've got another blip here that was almost 40%, a longer gap, which is better but still not amazing, and then what I believe is another blip here, which is down another gear. But again, it's not an amazing technique. What we're really looking for here is we want all the peaks to be the same height, and we want the spacing to be not quite uniform, but relatively close to uniform, and the gap between each shift increasing in size. Because if you think about it, the way the ratios are stacked, you want the difference in time to increase as you change down, because the gear has a longer working life. Really, if we go over then to the chassis tuning tab and we look at rear traction analysis, we can see quite clearly here that if we look, this is basically a graph of the corrected speed versus the two rear wheel speeds. Now you see this massive sawtooth type pattern going on here. This is where one of those downshifts was basically so bad, and we can see it again in the engine RPM. We can see here there's a lot of jagged lines, and you could see it in the video. You saw the tachometer bouncing around a lot. Basically what was happening was the downshift was so bad that we were locking up the rear wheels, and that's why we were getting this. Now that's really bad, because it gives us two things. First off, it reduces the amount of grip we've got available because we're basically locking up the rear tires. And secondly, it can give us the impression that we have too much rear brake bias, which is actually correct, because we're applying more locking force by being basically really bad on the downshifts. So as you can see here, you can see that this is a pretty easy way of noticing that the downshifting technique is the problem. And that's kind of the point of the workbook, is that you can use this without actually making any changes to the car to find out that it's the driver that needs adjustment. Which sounds kind of a funny thing, but it's also fairly obvious, because as I've said, this can skew your impressions of the brake bias. Now if we look at a lap in a later session that I did, if we go to this 2:13.1, and then if we let's look at the same turn. Now again, you can see that we're still locking up the rear slightly, but it's nowhere near as aggressively. So just through the practice, my technique has improved. And if we just jump back quickly to the driver technique and the throttle application, we can see that now the blips from the throttle are much more uniform in size, which is much better and much more like what we want. You can see that this blip here was not quite strong enough, and if we go back to the chassis tuning and rear traction analysis, you can see that where that blip was clearly was the worst of the three. And you can see that again caused the rears to lock up, and again caused an RPM fluctuation. Okay, so that's how you can use this to look at how your driving technique is affecting how the car's performing, and that's an example just there to show basically how you can analyze downshifting technique through using these couple of tabs. So now let's look at how we're braking. So if we take a look at turn 1 of lap 4, so if we go to lap 4 and we find turn 1 on the map and highlight the segment, you can see that it was really poor again, but that's not what we want to look at here quickly. If we go to setting brake bias, this basically shows the rear wheel speeds and the front wheel speeds all on the same chart, and this is really the tab that I was envisaging that people would use to tune brake bias. If we look at the front wheels and we ignore the rear wheels for now, we know that my downshifting technique was poor, and that was what was causing rear lockup. But let's look at the front wheels. So as you can see, the green line is basically what the overall speed of the car is and what the car should be. As you can see, we have the blue line, which is the front left, and the red line, which is the front right. Now coming down into the turn, as we can see, when we first press the brake pedal, we get this little bit of a lockup from both wheels, but only slight, so that's okay. But then as you see here, we get a fairly large lockup happening of both wheels, and as you can see, we can see that's happening. And then to resolve the lockup, I lifted the pedal and released the pressure a little bit, and that brought us a little bit back in line, but still not an amazing amount. But that's basically how you can see that you were reacting to the situation, but whilst obviously seeing in the data that there was a lockup of both, indicating that you were either too heavy on the brakes or the brake bias is too much to the front. In this case, I think I was just too heavy on the brakes, and I made a poor downshift, so that probably didn't help. If we continue looking along here, we can see that as we start to move into the corner, if you look at the dot at the top of the screen, you can see that there's a divergence between the blue and the red lines. Now, as we've said, that the blue line is the front left and the red line is the front right. Now, if we look, and we can see that the blue line actually tracks the green line all the way through the turn, whilst the red line doesn't at all. Now, this that big difference there, you can see, we can tell pretty clearly that the front right was almost on the verge of completely locking up, which is not what we want. But at the same time, these kind of things aren't normally that bad. The reason for that is because the front left is what's carrying all the load, because it's a right hand corner, and the front right is somewhat along for the ride. So a big lockup on the inside tyre is not always going to cause you a huge problem. It's not ideal, but it's also not the worst thing either. And really, this is not necessarily a bad thing that you can see happening here, because what it means is that I was basically on the limit of what was capable of the braking performance of the car, and that's good, because if you're looking at how a driver is driving the car, you want to see them at the limit of the car's performance. So if this red line was tracking this blue line and the green line perfectly throughout the turn, as it is on exit here, that's not really necessarily what you want, because it means that there's performance left on the table. So really, you do want to see the inside wheel having a little bit of difference, as just a little bit of a partial lockup. Like, kind of up to here is kind of okay. This is obviously not ideal, and you don't really want to see that. But partially, I'm just trying to say that partial lockups are not normally a terrible thing. Full lockups like this are bad, and here is definitely bad, because it's both wheels locked up, and we really don't want to look at that. Well, we don't want to see that. So that's just basically looking at how you can use the data to tell you where you've got lockups occurring, and if you look at this, if we pick a segment here where there wasn't a downshift occurring and there wasn't really a front lockup occurring either, you can see that actually what we've got here is we've got decent braking performance going on here, where we've got a slight bias towards the front, because we can see that there's some more front lockup. We're kind of on the verge of a front lockup at this point, but you can actually see that the bias is okay, and so really, if I improve my downshifting technique and I just basically get some more practice in the car, I don't really need to move the bias, and that's a good thing, because if I move the bias forward, I might find that the rear locking decreases whilst maintaining my poor technique, and that'll basically increase my braking zone length, and I'll lose time when really what I should be doing is focusing on driving the car better. So it's really just a band-aid to fix something that I should be fixing myself. So now we've looked at that, let's just take a quick look at how we can look at the speed and the steering angle traces, and how we can use that to analyze how we're driving. So if we go to driving technique and we go to steering technique tab, and if we have a look at, if we overlay laps 1 and 4 on top of each other, we'll take lap 1 to be our base lap, and we will take 4 to be our overlay. If we just have a quick look here, we can see that throughout the overlay lap is gaining significant amounts of time on us. Now, if we look, we can see that there was a big change here But this was where I had a big lockup on 4, and you can see that actually the total difference there was not so large. But where we were really losing time in sort of abundance was this end segment of the lap. So as you can see, that's through 10 and 11 here. So if we just highlight this end segment, you can see that we lost from about 1.35 through to about 1.7. So we're losing about 3/10 or so through this segment. Now let's have a look at why that's actually happening. So as you can see, we're coming up to 10 here, and we must have had the same exit speed out of 9, and that's good because we were both relatively there. But then as we enter 10, we can see that lap 1, which is shown as the red line here, we can see that lap 1 carried a little bit more speed in, but then carried a lot less speed out, and carried that speed all the way up to 11, and then was slower through 11 and slower out onto the main straight. Now the question to answer is to why did that happen, and what caused it, and how we can look at how we can solve it. Now if we look, we can see here we're basically dead leveling on almost everything. We can see the speed's the same, the wheel angle is almost the same, but then here we can see that when we get to this point where we're at the slowest, we can see that our faster lap overlay had a wheel angle of 51.4 degrees, and our slower first lap had a steering angle of 65.6, but we're also going slower. Okay, what does that tell us? That tells us that most likely we were understeering through this turn on our first lap here, and that was why we were slower. And because we understeered, we ended up on an incorrect line and carried poor speed through 11, and that's why we were slow. Oh, I didn't want to do that. That's why we were slow through 10, and then into 11, and then onto the straight. So if we just have a quick look at the video, maybe we can see if that actually did happen. Okay, so this is lap 1, and we're coming through 9, coming up the hill towards 10. Now our hypothesis is understeer, and as you can see, we completely missed the apex and went really wide there, and then we were then slow all the way through this segment. But if we just move back quickly, you can see here, when you pause, it doesn't really show a great image, but you can see that there's a lot of wheel in there, and that lot of wheel corresponds with this point here, where there was a lot more wheel in compared with the fast lap, and consequently we were going much slower. So that's just an example of how you can see, using both the video and both MoTeC, well, using both the video and MoTeC, to see what's happening and correlate it with what did happen with regards to the video. Now I spotted that this was possibly an understeer scenario without actually looking at the video. Now, yes, I obviously did drive the laps and whatnot, but my real point on this is that if you did have 2 laps like this and you saw this, now hopefully you can look at it and you can spot in the telemetry without seeing the video that this is what happened. And that's really the aim I'm trying to get. I'm trying to achieve here, is I'm trying to show you that you can spot these in the telemetry without actually looking and driving the laps yourself. Now, the other thing you can actually use the steering angle line graph to show you is you can use this to look at balance changes. For example, if we increase the rear anti-roll bar and decrease the front one, we would expect that the car would then have a lot more oversteer. Now, we might see this in the data as if we look at, say, a high-speed turn, if we looked at 7 here, and we would hope that we would see, if we were trying to resolve an understeer scenario, we would hope that we would see less wheel input by the driver, and that you could see that through the wheel angle, and so that's a way of analysing any changes you've made, especially if high-speed corners where wheel angle should be relatively constant, especially if the corner is long. So that's another way you can use this. You can also use this to pick out areas of possible oversteer. Like if we see here, we can see this big, we've got this big spike up where the wheel goes into the opposite direction. Now we know that the corner goes to the right, so we're expecting the driver to be turning the wheel right. So if we suddenly see the wheel go left, we know that there was a handling issue that caused him to do that, and that's pretty obviously going to be an oversteer scenario. Now if we take a look at the video, maybe we can see this. Just have a quick see there, see the little flick back the other way, and then if we're turning it through here, and then again there, just see how the wheel just quickly snap back to the opposite direction. Now if we look at the trace, we can see that on both laps this happened in the transition period between 10 and 11. So we can kind of assume that that is either a car balancing or a track issue that's causing that. Now conversely, we can see that this was with the same setup, and we can see that coming through 11 we had one lap where there was oversteer and one lap where there wasn't. So we can conclude that this area here, this was driver induced. I mean, this might also have been driver induced, but if we see this consistently and this inconsistently, we can conclude that this one is likely due to a car or track issue, and that this one is likely due to a driver issue. Okay, so if we now just take a quick look at using the video again, and if we look at how we can use our own math channels within MoTeC to pick up some issues. If we have a quick look at the tire tab, you can see that there is a rate of change of temps tab. Now what this basically is this is basically picking up what areas in which the tire temperature change is pretty severe, as we can see from these peaks here. Now you can see these big peaks that we're getting here. These are most likely coupled to poor down changing, and that's again because they're the rear tire peaks, and basically they're aggressive changes in tire temperature. If we there is an area that I want to look at. I noted in the video that there was the area of bounce. Now if we try and look at when that was, I actually recorded this in a later session. So if I go to, I believe it was on lap 2 of this session, and in turn 4. So if we take a quick look in this segment, I've highlighted much too long a segment there. There we go. That's much better. And if we remove the overlay so that we can see this more clearly, if we look at the left front here, as I noted when we were watching those 4 laps, in especially the uphill left-hander after the Corvette banner, I noted that when you use the inside curb you found a lot of bounce of the left front, and I found that again when I ran through a later session. And if we look at this top graph here, we can see that we've got these three spikes here accompanied by these areas of flats. Now if the tire's in contact with the ground, then it's that there is energy transfer, and there is going to be a tire temperature change. And as you can see through here, this is sort of normal behavior here, where we see a bit of temperature increase because we're just starting to load up the tire as we're turning in for the corner. Any areas where there's flats is bad, and the reason it's bad is because if there's flats, that means that the temperature is not changing, and that likely means that either even on a straight you'll see some variation, but it likely means the tire's off the ground. And these areas here are clearly where the tire is impacting the surface and gaining a lot of energy and heating up before then being off the ground again. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate here is these 3 peaks tell us that there's basically an instability in that left front corner, because the tire ideally should always be running along the ground. Now, what we can do if we look at this is we can see you can see the flats more clearly now. Now, I did a slow-mo of the front left corner. Now, if we look here, we can see that basically the distance between the top of the wheel rim and the top of the wheel arch is relatively uniform. Now, if we come in, we can see that it compresses up a little bit, but then we're kind of in a normal range as it comes across. But then there's a fairly big compression there, and then a big difference in the gap, and then another big compression there, followed by again another one, and then I believe one more. Yeah. Okay, so what am I trying to illustrate with this? What I'm trying to show you here is, in this video I was looking at the difference between the top of the wheel rim and the bottom of the wheel arch. The reason I was looking at that was because I can use that to see what the damping is like on that corner of the car. In short, if you go over a curb and you're feeling a big disturbance in the car, but if you look and that gap isn't changing, and say the distance between the wheel rim and the top of the wheel arches is constant during this bouncing, either it's not happening at that corner of the car, or what's happening is that it's actually the tire that's compressing and then extending, and you're actually bouncing on the tire. Now, that normally means that you've got too much damping, because the assembly can't, it's not compliant enough to absorb the energy from the induced by the bump, and so you want to reduce high-speed damping if you can in that kind of scenario. But in this scenario, as we saw, the gap was changing. Now, what that means is that the system is underdamped, because it's compressing the suspension is extending again, and then it's compressing again, extending. It's oscillating on that corner, and really we would kind of only want to see this once, twice, or you can see that the oscillation is subsiding because the heights and the peaks are getting much less. But really, it would be nice if if we had the one big bump, it landed, then we had a small bump, and that was it. 3 is probably kind of okay, but a possible solution to this is if we were to increase our rebound damping. Now, really, there's a couple of different sort of opinions on this. This is just the way I do it, so this is not necessarily the right way, or it might not be the way that you're accustomed to, or so on. Basically, I would suggest that you look at the high-speed damping first, and the reason I suggest looking at the high-speed damping first is because low speed is focused on basically body rolling corners and normal sort of behavior, like hitting the brakes and the body sort of diving forward. Now, that's what low speed controls. High speed is about when you're hitting bumps. Now, I know that not all cars in iRacing have independent high and low speed adjustment, but if it does have high speed adjustment, I would try increasing your high speed setting first. If you can't, then increase the general setting, and I would suggest increasing rebound first and then looking at bump afterwards. If we continue sort of looking at this, well, I say looking at this, I mean looking at dampers. If we go to the chassis tuning page and we look at the damper analysis tab, we can see, well, this is actually illustrating a point that I wanted to talk about. So, as you can see here, these graphs are basically completely useless. Now the reason they're completely useless is because they're taken over such a short time period. And if I actually if I look at lap 1 of our first run, we can see that here the peaks are much more easily spotted, and you can see that it appears to be working better. Now if we reduce our sample size, we can see that everything sort of goes pretty distorted and we can't really make any conclusions. But then as we increase the sample size, everything starts to level out and we start to see something that we can actually use. Now this is illustrating the point that I've tried to make a number of times before, and that's that really you should try and, if you're going to use a damper histogram, you really try and get as much data as possible. And the reason you're trying to do that is because the more samples you've got, the more accurate, well, not more accurate, but the more reliable the data set you're using is going to be. And so even, I mean, 4 laps is to be honest really not enough time, but it's the largest run I've got, so that's what we're going to work with. So if we're looking at this, what can we really see about what's happening? Well, initially the answer is not really much, and that's kind of a good thing in this scenario, because this is looking as you would kind of want it to do already. It's a uniform distribution relatively. It's got if we look at the front left, it's a uniform distribution relatively. We've got a bit of skew over towards the bump side, particularly actually if we look at the difference between high speed bump and high speed rebound, there's a just under 2% difference. If we look at low speed, we've got again just under 2% difference. So we can see that the damper spends more time in the bump segment in general compared to the rebound segment. Now, as a sort of a first off kind of thing, what I normally try to do is I normally try to get it so that you've got a normal distribution in general, and so that your average shock velocities on both rebound and bump are both the same. As you can see here, we've got 37.81 millimeters a second as our average speed in bump, and 40.27 in rebound. So that kind of backs up what we were saying and seeing about how the damper is skewed to the right side. It spends more time in the bump segment. It spends especially more time in the low speed bump. But the other thing that you can conclude is normally I try and get these bins all to be about 25% to start with before I start making any changes. So when I'm looking at this and I'm seeing that we're seeing 25.6% in rebound for high speed rebound and 22.8% in low speed rebound, I'm kind of concluding that there's probably not enough overall damping on this corner in terms of rebound, because it's moving faster than I would like. Now, any adjustment you make to the damper in terms of, if you want to increase the damping, what you're basically doing is you're increasing the amount of force the damper provides for a given speed. And so by increasing the damper, by increasing the damping strength, you're slowing the damper down, and so you'll find that this average speed will reduce. So in this instance, what I would do before I try to adjust the skew is I would probably give 2 clicks more to both rebound and bump, just to see that if we can bring the damper into the slow speed region more. And in the theory of it goes is that if we do that, then hopefully scenarios like we saw with the bouncing, hopefully scenarios like that will be less frequent, and we'll gain some performance from it. We might even be able to ride curbs better. But as a sort of a general idea, the kind of profile shapes that you've got here, they're pretty good. If you're seeing the dampers like this and you think the car handles well, you probably don't really need to spend that much time focusing on this. They're working as they should, and that's fine. Where you want to be concerned is if you've got say a peak there and then a trough there and then another peak there. Now that's really bad, because what that generally means is that you've just got nowhere near enough damping and the car is probably bouncing all over the place. It's basically spending so much time in the high speed region, and there's just not enough damping of that corner. So avoid that and try and aim for profiles like this. Try and aim for 25, 25, 25 in these bins to start with, and then make adjustments from there. If you find that having, I don't know, a skew across to the bump side, and say that you've got like 24s here and 26s here, and that works for you, that's absolutely fine. I'm not saying change that, but as a thing to start with, go with trying to get these to be 25s and then work from there, because then you'll find that dampers are probably working as they should do. I know there's this opinion that in iRacing the dampers don't work properly anyway, somewhat. I agree, because on my NASCARs I set them to be maximum the entire time, and I have done that for weeks. So I can see that yes, there is that school of thought, and that's okay as well. But anyway, we spent far too much time on this, so let's have a look at looking at camber. Now, if you go down to the tires segment, and if we look at temperatures first, let's just take a look at lap 4. Okay, so if we're looking at lap 4, and let's just take a look at turn 1 here. So if we take that, that's probably turn 1. Yep. Okay, so if you look here, for every tyre on the car, I have plotted the inside, a centre, and the outside is also plotted, and if you right click and unhide, you can see that it's there. The reason I have hidden them is because currently the way tyre temperatures appear to work in iRacing is kind of broken. You will always get this massive disparity between the outside and the centre and the inner, and the way I set tyre camber, that sounds a bit of a weird way to say it. The way I sort of aim for how my temperature distribution is and how my wear is, and basically that's generated from my camber setting, is I just look at the inside and the middle edges. And what I really try to do here is I try and get it so that the middle and the inside are the same for a turn that is opposite to the tyre. So in a right hand turn I look at my left side tyres, and in a left hand turn I look at my right side tyres. Now on this we can see that we've got probably about a 0.5 degree difference there, and it's in favour of the inside edge. So what that's telling me is that there is likely too much there is likely too much camber on that end of the car. And actually we can see that as a kind of a general trend as you go through. It seems to be a lesser issue on the rear, because there's only a very minor camber difference, temperature difference. So we can say that the rear is probably only very slightly over cambered. But on the front I would definitely look at reducing camber and trying to get these to be equal. Okay, so now that we've found that you can set camber by looking at the temperatures, if we also go over to the wear and camber tab, you'll see that we've got these 4 heat maps, the 4 pressure readouts, and all the temperature and all the wear indicators. And basically these boxes, these will light up if your inside edge is more worn than your middle. So a pretty quick way of getting yourself in the ballpark for this is to basically reduce the camber to the point where these boxes unlight after a long run, and then go back 0.1 or 0.2 of a degree, and then run again, and if they light up, then you know that you're within a 0.2 degree range roughly, as to what is about right. The logic for this is literally just the inside wear minus the middle. On here you can see that it's lit up even though the difference is apparently 0 to 2 decimal points, but the data is outputted to something silly like 8 decimal points. So probably further along the inside is very slightly more worn. But if we look at the left side, you can see that there is a 0.01% difference. It's not massive, but I mean, if we cross-reference it with what we found on the temperatures tab, you can see that there is a difference, and it's not quite exactly where you want it. Now, I'll just quickly show the pressures tab. As you can see here, it's kind of difficult to actually see anything from it initially. The reason for that is obviously we're only looking at one lap. Well, we're actually only looking at one slight segment of a lap. But if we look at all 4 laps, we'll get a bit more of a range. But you can see that the pressure was still climbing after 4. And this is why I always say that you should do a much longer run, because after a certain number, the pressures will stabilize out. And so if we actually go and we just grab a log file, let's just I'll just grab this one. Oh, it's already open, that's why. If I go to data and I expand it, if I take all these laps, and you can see even after 17 laps, this was with a different car, this was with the Xfinity car at MoTeC, even after 17 laps, the pressures are only really just kind of starting to stabilize out. But you can see here in this range between 1 and 6 really. This is why I say always do a long run, because if you look between 1 and 6, the pressure change is massive, whereas the later you go on, especially 10 and onwards, it starts to stabilize out. There's still about a 1 psi difference between 10 and 17, but we're much closer. So that's really why doing as long a run as possible is really the way to go. So I'll just get off that quickly. I'll expand MoTeC out because we're probably done looking at the video now. Okay, so if we now move on to looking at gearing, actually just before we do that, I'll just introduce the track maps and the heat maps. I touched on it very briefly over on this tab on the tires page on the wear and camber, and showed that you've got these ones for this area. I'll just talk a little bit about this quickly whilst we're here. As you can see, this is kind of just a sort of a quick way of figuring out which tires are loaded the most and where really, and where they're sort of at their peak. So you can see, for example, the rears were always really having the most load sort of in traction zones, whereas the fronts, the fronts there are pretty loaded compared with the rear on that side. All these graphs have the same scale, so they are directly comparable. Although what I would say is when I set this up, I was really looking sort of at a bit of a NASCAR tilt on this. So that's why they're all about the upper bounds are about 270. But you can change that yourself if you feel necessary. But anyway, I'll just quickly go back to this map. So this is a pretty basic map. This is literally just the circuit map with speed as the heat color. Now you can't really tell a great deal from this one, because all you can really do is pick out where you were quickest and which corners were the slowest. So for example, we can see that turn 3 is slowest, and we can also, if we look at this little box, it's got a 52 on it and 6,000 RPM. So that shows us that was the slowest corner in this lap. If we look, we can see the max straightaway speed before that corner was 157. And if we look for at the top one, we can see that the first main straight, we can see that the top speed is almost the same. Although if we look, the difference in speed between the corner speed and the straightaway speed is much less. We were going 84 there, whereas we're going 52 in turn 3. And that's really how you can just sort of pick out where your heaviest braking zones are going to be. Like, you know that it's going to be 3 rather than 1, just because the speed difference is much larger. But if we kind of take that one step further, and we can start looking, if we go and look at the gearing tab and we go to the gear map, here I've overlaid the gear as the color. Now what we can tell from this is we can basically see what gears we're using for what corners, and we can also see how many down changes we're doing for a turn. We can see if there's any areas where gears are overlapping or where we're hitting the top of another one when we shouldn't be. For example, I will pick lap 1 because I know I down changed too many times for the last turn, and you can see that we've got a change in the middle. Now I know that was driver influenced, but my point here is that you can really use this to see if you've got any other non-driver influenced problems that you might want to address. For example, if we had like a gear change in the middle of 10, you would either look at shortening the higher gear so that you could shift to it earlier, or lengthening the lower gear. So that's really the purpose of this map, is to see that the ratios are actually working the way you want them to. What we can actually also look at if we go to speed ratio analysis, this is a tab which you could use if you were looking at different gearing combinations. For example, if I'd have put the longer final drive in, what I would expect to see is less changes, RPM increases that were shallower, and I would also expect to see that corrected speed possibly coming out of a corner to be the same, but probably certainly in the first half, probably see that we would be reaching higher speeds at a slower rate. So for example, we're seeing here we'd be hitting 154, so I think I got up to 155 on this lap, down into 3. We might see that we were only hitting 153 or something with the longer gears because we're accelerating slower. And that's really kind of how you can use the gear map to sort of, well, the gear map and this page to tell you how your gearing is working. And if you want to make a change to a certain ratio, it's probably more relevant. For example, if you thought that fourth could be slightly shorter, but keeping all the other ratios the same, you might want to look at the gear map to make sure that you weren't going to be hitting the top of fourth in any corners. For example, if you could change the gearing in this car, you would want to make sure that you weren't moving this shift point here back into the turn. But at the same time, if you're looking at corrected speed, you might see that because you were accelerating faster at another point on the circuit, the time you were gaining through doing that was worth more. So that's really what you can do with the gearing tab. You could also use it to look at aerodynamics, but I've already touched on that. Basically, just looking at the corrected speed and seeing if there's an advantage to running more wing or less. But that's pretty much as far as we need to go on that. So now if we just take a look at the last major thing, which is going to be the chassis tuning, splitter and ride heights page. Basically what we've got here is we've got corrected speed again, because I always put corrected speed on every chart because I think it's the most useful. We've got splitter height and we've got rake, and at the top here we've got all the ride heights from around the car, the steering angle, throttle position, brake pedal position, speed is just a digital readout, and a light here which will illuminate basically if the splitter is ever hitting the ground. It's probably not really that relevant for this car because it's if we look at the splitter height, we can see that even at its lowest point around this lap, it was still only about 50 millimeters off the ground. So there's really no need for us to look at it for this car in terms of the splitter height. But for something like the Gen 6 or the Daytona prototype, the HPD, things where the splitter is very close to the ground and you either want it as close to the ground as possible, such as in the Gen 6, but without contacting the ground perhaps unnecessarily, then you can use this to really tell you. But what I would say is you must take into account the fact that this is the middle of the car. So just because the middle of the car is off the ground doesn't necessarily mean that the sides aren't hitting the ground. And that's why I've included these at the top, really, just so that if you were looking at an oval, for example, I mean this workbook is mainly centered around road courses, but if you were looking at an oval, you'd be able to see, say the splitter height was 3 millimeters or something, and the left front was riding at 80 and the right front was riding at 75, well, if there's a 5 millimeter difference across the car, then if you think, well, in the middle, if it was 80 on the left, 75 on the right, in the middle it should be 77.5, and so therefore if the splitter height is registering as 3, over on the corner which is lowest, it's actually 0.5, which probably means it's actually on the ground. So that's just something to keep in mind, and that's why these are here. Another thing you can also do with these, if you left click and then right click and go to properties, you can see I've put a range on them, and basically it will illuminate if it ever goes less than 40 millimeters for this. That's really an arbitrary number, but you can change that depending on what car you're in. And you could use this as an indication of, say, when you were hitting your bump spring, or when you were hitting the bump stop in something like the C-Spec, which has adjustable bump stop gaps. I know that you're looking at ride heights, whereas perhaps for something like that you would actually want to look at the actual damper position, and I think you can actually change these to be a damper position output, but I'm not 100% sure. But if you can, you could change that, and that would obviously be an easier method for you to do it. But you would always still have to input the number manually, which is fine. You just have to remember that. We've included rake because, again, on some cars it can make a big difference. Really, this is just so that you can say if you raise the rear by 10 millimeters. And then you can look at, or say for example you put a stiffer rear spring in, you'll see that it's not sitting down as much. Say the ride height might go from 25 to 30 millimeters, and you can see how that might affect your straightaway speed and things like that by looking at the corrected speed and using an overlay. So that's really it for this. I mean, it can be extended out so that, say for example, these boxes up here took into account things like the track bar mount on the Gen 6. So you could change it so that you knew how high the track bar mount was from the ground, which is useful at like a super speedway or something. But really, that's something that you could do yourself. It's pretty simple. If someone wants to know how to do that, I can quite easily show them because I've got it on one of my other workbooks. It's just not included on this one because this is supposed to be generalized, whereas I thought that was quite a car specific sort of feature. So the last thing we'll look at is, if we go to the track and weather, is the weather station. Now this is kind of an unnecessary thing because you have obviously the output in iRacing, which tells you what the track temp, what the air temp was, and obviously what the sky condition was, the wind speed and the humidity and so on. But this was really just so that you didn't have to note those down, and so that you always had a reference point within MoTeC that you could just look at and just see as to what the actual weather conditions was without having to note it down or go back to the session ID or something like that. It's pretty self-explanatory, to be honest. You've got the track temp, the air temp is shown up there along with the graph. I've graphed it like this as a sort of a preemptive thing based on assuming at some point down the line we're going to have a truly dynamic air and track temp. So that's why it's like this, but you're obviously free to make it a digital readout like wind speed and wind direction. An interesting thing to note is you can also sometimes, actually we won't see the wind velocity change because this is a constant weather session, but these are dynamic values and they will move around unless you've done a fixed weather session like I did here. I don't think relative humidity changes. I think that always stays the same as well. The only thing to really explain here is to how these boxes work. Basically, iRacing will output a number depending on what skybox it is, whether it's clear, partly cloudy, mostly cloudy, or overcast. From what I've observed, basically the higher the number, the higher the condition. So a 0 is a clear, a 1 is a partly cloudy, a 2 is a mostly cloudy, and a 3 is an overcast. I'm not 100% on this, but I think that's what it is. And these boxes are basically set up so that whichever is last illuminated is what the condition is. So in this case, partly cloudy is the last illuminated, therefore it's partly cloudy session. And that's really it, to be honest. I believe I've gone through all the tabs, and hopefully that this has been productive, and you now understand how to do things like how to objectively set brake bias rather than just on feel, how you can look at traction issues, how you can use damper histograms, how you can look at how you can analyze your error by looking at splitter heights, rake, and really so you can do things like set camber and pressures without really having any sort of black art sort of, well, I think it should be this kind of number. You can actually use this workbook and you can figure it out as basically an actual thing that you're aiming for, rather than just based on feel. And hopefully you can also use, especially this first folder with the tabs of the speed, lap time, the throttle application, the braking technique, and the steering technique. Hopefully you can use this to improve how you drive the car before you move on to then looking at what the conditions are, setting your gearing, which is a relatively easy task. It can be quite tricky in cars which have got massively adjustable ratios, but you'll normally find what works quite quickly. And then moving into the chassis tuning bit that we've been talking about. Now it is arranged sort of as a bit of a progressive thing, in that you will start on 1 and hopefully you will end on 5. It's not linear necessarily when you're actually going through it in a real sense. I mean, for example, when I'm doing a Gen 6 setup, I'll spend 90% of my time looking at this tab here, the splitter and ride heights, with a couple of different things added in the corners that I want to look at, like track bar heights and things like that. But really, you should be able to progress through the book, and it should give you a car that uses its tyres as it should, uses its dampers as it should, and if it does have any issues with regards to traction or brake bias or whatever, you can easily go to someone, even if you're not the setup guy. You can go, hey, I think it needs a bit more, a bit softer rear spring or something to give me a bit more traction, or I think it needs more front brake bias or something like that. And that's really the point of this book. And yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up. What I will be doing is I will be putting this up as a separate thing on the iRacing forum, and I'll be hosting the workbook there. I'll put a link so that you can get to that, but you can either comment on this or you can comment there. Either way is completely fine. I appreciate this has probably gone on for quite some time as usual, but I thought it really had to really get across all the information. So yeah, if you've got any comments, any criticisms, that's all fine, just let me know.